Oh, no.
Perfect. All right. So as far as the unit overview goes, this one is sectioned off into 3 lessons. And essentially, our compelling question this time around is all about power. How do we balance power? Power was one of the, it may not have been the named, here's the elephant in the room, but most of those struggles were about, okay, how much representation? Do big states get, big states get more power than the little states? Why should the little state count as much as my vote? So I really felt like the key here was to keep it balanced on power, especially since the major differences between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution really dealt with how much, who had what power and how much, and the reason why it failed was they didn't necessarily get that correct. So with how do we balance power being the compelling question, we've got 3 smaller lessons this time around. First one gets the Articles of Confederation out of the way. So our first supporting question is, what were the Articles of Confederation and why did they fail? I could have broken this into 2 questions, but it just wasn't as necessary because I think kids get there pretty quickly. Then we move into what issues did those in attendance at the Constitutional Convention face? And then the final lesson is what compromises were reached at the Constitutional Convention. Played with a lot of different wording for that final question. In the end, I went that route because I wanted a clear connection into what we did last year with 8th grade. 8th grade, that entire chunk of 8th grade units tends to blame your content in 5th grade for a lot of the problems that 8th grade faces. In terms of all of those struggles that lead up to the Civil War were a result of compromises that were made or in some cases not made during the Constitutional Convention that play out over the next 100 years. And to be honest, some of them into high school as well. Mm-hmm. So we went the compromise route because it mirrors some of the questions that we ask and ask kids to think back to 5th grade to in 8th grade. And it felt like a really good, bridge there. So any questions at all over the overview and the compelling questions and supporting questions overall for this unit? Any over at Bay Aranac? All right. Going to move then into lesson 1. So lesson 1 really starts to get into this how do we balance power idea in terms of the Articles of Confederation. As usual, if you are using these as your learning targets in classroom, as opposed to I can statements, I have your posters that you can print off and just keep in your room available for this. How many of you actually use those? Good, okay, cool. I always like to know when those things are actually in use, so.
Like paint? Like I played around and I have some just black and white, some I did the background teal, the black one I just did white and put it on black.
Yeah.
You know, you have to put on construction paper on that way.
Well,
I did it for like my 6th grade, or I did it in 6th grade, and I did it so that next year all I do is like a tape them up.
Yep. Yep.
I do the compelling question, the supporting question, and then I tape up learning targets, but I like how these have the standards.
When I started, when I started moving my principles up north towards the idea of, hey, you can let go of your checklist that requires I can study social studies learning target to appear on the board. You know, you can let go of that and have there be a question. And, you know, I had a couple of them that were, well, how will I know what content it's over? And I was like, can you tell what content it's over now? I didn't say that, but I kind of wanted to. So I was like, well, what if I put the coding for the content expectation on some of those posters? They're like, yeah, that'd be good. So, you know, I made sure I put those up there. And because these are a manageable number of expectations, I actually put the actual expectation wording on the supporting questions for you this time around. So any principal with their checklist is able to clearly say, you have a learning objective of some sort on the board, this time in the form of a question, and it is linked to standards. God bless them. They're so busy. So we've got those available, and then I wanted to talk just a little bit about how the colonies game ends. everyone's going to obviously want you to declare a winner for colonies. And I'm not certain you can actually declare a winner. I mean, anyone who has survived without their colony starving to death is technically a winner, correct? So I'm going to do the ultimate cop-out and say it's up to you to determine who the winner is. However, I think some of you laughed at that and some of you gave me that, don't you look at me in that tone of voice, mister. Look, so that's awesome. Between the scenario for this unit and something related to it that I throw out in lesson 3, you may have some opportunities for declaring an all-out winner here. So the scenario this time around is essentially the Constitutional Convention. They've been these separate but linked colonies for a long time. They now have survived the Revolutionary War, and they need to figure out how to unite their colonies together. This will be a great discussion to have before you even study the Articles of Confederation to get them brainstorming, because it'll be interesting for them to then take a look and see, oh man, yeah, one of those ideas I had, they had that same idea too. Oh cool, they had that idea, it must have worked. And then ultimately it's like, oh crap, it didn't work as you get further in. So this is the scenario for the whole unit of Unit 7, but it gets introduced right out of the gate, just like normal in Lesson 1. It's this time around, though, the last 3 units, I think, have had 2 scenarios. We've only given them this one. So they're going to grapple with it throughout the whole study of the Articles of Confederation and then the whole study of the Constitutional Convention. As far as what comes next, as far as the articles themselves go, I went 12 different avenues before I decided on this one. I've actually pulled out from American Memory the actual text of the Articles of Confederation. It's not long. It's a little bit longer than you would want any 1 5th grader to read all on their own. And so what I ended up doing, Becky and I discussed this a little bit. Every year, it was the darndest thing. I had a different group of kids every year. Some years I could throw large amounts of complex, rich text in front of them and they'd gobble it up. And it was like that dream class. It's like, when you envision when you're first entering college and you're like, my classroom someday is going to be like this. I actually had a year or 2 of that, and it was a beautiful, beautiful thing. But then some years I had things where no matter how broken down I made it, it seemed like, it was pulling teeth, and it was worthwhile to do because they were practicing a skill. At least that's what I kept telling myself, that, may pay off a couple of years from now. But it depends each year on what group of kids you get. And more than likely, it's a very mixed ability group. So what I did for this was I provided you the full text of the Articles of Confederation, but I broke it up. I chunked it up so that you can choose, and I have some suggestions in here. So if you want your kids to read all of it and you've got a rough class size of 30 kids, 30 or less, go into 5 groups and chunk them out this way. Have group 1 jigsaw Articles 1 through 4, have group 2 just look at 5 and 6, have group, have a group look at 7 and 8, have a group look at 9 is long. So 9, if you keep 9 in the mix for this, it's the longest one. It gets into specific powers and things like that. If you pull 9 out because it's an important one, make sure that you give that to a group that's going to be able to take about a page of printed text, because that's about what it ends up being when you look at what's on one page and what's on the next. So just keep that in mind. That's why on all of these where it's listed, it's one group does all of that. If you want even smaller groups than that, then you can chunk it out into 7 groups, which would be roughly 3-4 kids in a group, in a classroom full of 30, and you can chunk it out that way. Now, if you want to do just some, I've provided you a potential scenario for doing just some with 5 groups, but 9 is out, and 9 is an important one, so I kind of struggled. With that. That might be one that you guys talk to the text together as a whole class on, but have the kids actually sink their teeth into these individual articles. Now, with the individual articles, you can see most of them outside of 9 aren't very long. So when you're into that 7 group one, you've got a group that's just looking at Article 1 and Article 2. For a 5th grader, that one probably isn't going to take very long for them to get through. So definitely scout ahead and go, okay, if I'm going to do it this way, I want to make sure certain groups get certain things. And the idea is that they would jigsaw following a normal jigsaw protocol. So everyone who's assigned as a 1, for example, goes off and reads their assigned text and by themselves, and then they get together with other 1s and talk about, okay, here's what I took from it, here's what I took from it. And then they get together with a 2 and a 3 and a 4, and they discuss that way, and then you can talk about it a whole group. So keep in mind that sections are shorter or longer depending on as you go through, but this is something I never did with my 8th graders during my slightly longer than it should have been 8th grade review of 5th grade material that I can admit 10 years later I did. But I kind of wish I had. So this is an activity that's available in here that, I tried to provide enough information for you to chunk out. Now, the one thing that is still missing from this is the reading guide that goes along with Open Book. So if you're using that, just know if you start this tomorrow, the reading guide isn't done. I believe I will have my brain processing power back again after Memorial Day weekend. It's been a rough couple of weeks. So that will be available then. You technically don't need it. It's not a very long section. I like to provide them, but just know that if you start this tomorrow, there's no reading guide and it won't be up until we get back from Memorial Day weekend. So I then, oops, on the wrong lesson. So that's actually next week, so never mind, because the reading guide for this one is done. I clicked back into the wrong table. I then give you guys something you can walk through with your kids after they've studied the Articles of Confederation. I then give you guys something to walk them through the problems with. So my hunch is 5th graders are going to be a lot like 8th graders when you walk them through something like this and they go, oh yeah, that sounds like it'd work, Mr. Johnson. That sounds, yeah, I'll bet that worked out well for them. And then you get to actually highlight some problems with the Constitution, or with the Articles of Confederation. And what I did with this was, it's a simple one-liner. So, like, the states didn't act immediately on things, and I gave an example of that. And then you're going to constantly ask, so why might that be a problem? And get kids to kind of identify what some reasons why Maryland holding out might be a bit of an issue. And then it goes through, and I've tried to make this go in ascending order from, oh, that's a tiny problem, to holy crap, that's a really bad idea, as you work through it. But each time it's, again, okay, why is this a problem? Why is this a problem? And then you can kind of close it with, take a look back at your notes, because I've asked you guys with this activity to have kids have a sheet of paper out, or take notes in Google Docs if you're doing it electronically, and just kind of keep track of, as you're discussing as a whole class what the problems were, kind of keeping track of those notes so that they can go back at the end of this and kind of rank it, and then have them justify why they think, this is the least of their worries and this is the biggest, because this all leads you into the reasons for the Constitutional Convention, which is coming up in a minute. So this was designed by design to be short, sweet, and to the point. And that sends me over, while I refill my soda, that sends me over to Becky, who is, I begged and pleaded Becky to help me get something really good in there for Shays, because I, again, was running out of time, and Becky saved the day with some really cool Shay stuff. So I'm going to let her, I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to let her talk about it, and by the time she needs me to move the screen, I'll be back from getting the soda.
You better run.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't run it unless zombies are chasing me, but I'll walk pretty quick.
Okay. So I think sometimes when I have seen teachers work with Shays Rebellion, it has kind of been a quick kind of gloss over. And I think that sometimes the result has been that students might have an understanding of who Daniel Shays was, why he was ticked off, why he was able to have other folks join him because they were also ticked off, and kind of the events that led up to the actual rebellion, and then sometimes what happened afterwards. And when we think about students really understanding how the Articles of Confederation come into play with this particular series of events, sometimes there's not a direct connection. So what does Shays Rebellion have to do with the Articles of Confederation being weak? Right? And so I put this together. Again, these are issues to consider, and you can use this however you choose. But for example, that first one, economic currency and the controversy surrounding state issued paper money, that's really big. And it doesn't, and it's not just really big in the state of Massachusetts where Shays Rebellion took place. It's big in all of the newly formed states. And again, if you look at some of those issues, those are big issues that don't just go away overnight. And so, you know, you may set those as end goals, you know, for your students to be able to talk about and to realize what those were and how those are related to the specific Articles of the Confederation. You can share those with them going into the events, you know, however you think your kids are going to benefit the most with being able to make those big picture connections to the need for the Constitution in the first place. The next thing that I did after I kind of tried to summarize probably the three biggest issues surrounding Shays Rebellion was I started just looking at different resources. Because, you know, when in doubt for social studies, sometimes you can stumble across some pretty good, succinct videos. But I found something much richer. And so I didn't even end up looking for videos, which is fantastic, right? Because it's nice to have a variety. And as I kind of delved further into these websites, I'm thinking, you know, when you have something great, why would you mess with it just to say that you created something on your own, right? I mean, good teachers steal. So I spent quite a bit of time on these two sites that we put in here. This first one is kind of a multiple culmination of many different historical societies and museums in the radius surrounding where Shays Rebellion actually took place. And they've got some pretty good resources on this website. And they kind of break it down into historical scenes, as well as they introduce you to every single person that, you know, comes into play, even in the tiniest way with regard to Shays Rebellion. Additionally, they have quite a few artifacts, which are really cool, because most of the time, again, with Shays Rebellion, we don't see a lot of those artifacts. But it's pretty neat because they're also pulling through a lot of the perspectives, so kids can get a more thorough understanding of why this was seen as a rebellion and what some of those really significant issues were all about and why they were so hotly debated. This is like I said, it's a great site. The only problem that is exacerbated this year in particular, you know, with our lovely winter weather that we experienced, is that it would take a substantial amount of time because there are lessons that are part of this website. If you spend any time on this home page, at the very, very bottom is a For Teachers tab. And when you click on that tab, you can see that there are 8 lessons, right? So this is meant to be a unit. You know, when you think about the scope of everything that you would find on this website. It's very thorough. But again, it's probably going to take some time, because as I looked through each of those lessons, I couldn't see one lesson taking less than a class period. So right off the bat, you're talking about 8 class periods if you were to use each of those lessons. So that you would probably have to do some picking and choosing if you were going to use any of those lessons. Again, not saying not to, because they're well done. Just you've got to gauge your time.
This year in particular.
Yeah.
Anybody got time for that?
The other website I wanted to include for a number of reasons. Good friend of mine was the assistant superintendent in Howard County Public Schools, just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. And he, for several years, through a Teaching American History grant, they had what they call the ARCH project. A lot of the teachers who were part of that TAH grant for consecutive years worked on doing just this, building some lessons depending on their area where they taught and what they wanted to kind of increase their level of experience, expertise with. And so this was, I think, one of the first ones that Mark's teachers put together on Shays Rebellion. And I love it because they don't know about the joke, but I have been a huge advocate for the skills in the 3, there you go, drink, that's the joke, the C3 framework. And what I really like about this lesson is that it's a lesson, okay? It's not a unit. I also really like all of the literacy standards as far as reading and writing skills, everybody drink, that are associated with it, as well as some of the historical thinking skills that come from the C3 framework. So as you scroll down, you can kind of take a look at it. The part that I find really powerful is that they have some excerpts from correspondence from George Washington, and they're very, very short. If you scroll down a couple of pages, Dave, you can see that they're all on one page, which I love, because the kids can just go right to the important pieces. Yeah, keep going. So for example, next couple pages. They give a lot of background, they have resources, for kids to really analyze what they're looking at. And then here is where they're going to be drawing conclusions unique to George Washington's viewpoint on the rebellion and conclusions unique to Jefferson's viewpoint on the rebellion. And again, this is something that I often see gets overlooked when we're talking about the rebellion. Usually it's just this is what happened, this is why, this is how things ensued thereafter. Whereas this is really talking about important government leaders and their take on this. And so the kids can quickly see the distinct differences. I mean, and they'll say things like, well, you know, the key word that would describe George Washington was embarrassment. He was embarrassed, and he publicly said so, and he wrote in, you know, various correspondence about how he was embarrassed that Americans were struggling so greatly with self-government. Whereas Thomas Jefferson, you know, is a little bit raise the roof. A little revolution every now and then is a good thing, right? And so, okay, if those are pretty distinct differences, did they have anything in common? What did they see eye to eye on? And the biggest takeaway in this exercise is they both saw the need for reform for government. That's the biggie right there. But I love how they get to it. And so this is, in my opinion, a strong set of very short documents that you could have your students work with, probably in a class period. And I think they would get a lot out of it from the standpoint of practicing, you were early, the historical thinking skills, like contextualization, for example, as well as the reading and writing.
Laid out really nice. The key.
Yep.
Writing component.
Yep. And again, depending on if you've got time. And then if you go back to the lesson, I had put a formative or summative assessment there that, you know, basically asked the kids to think about it from the standpoint of contextualization. If Washington and Jefferson had agreed in their responses to Shays' Rebellion, would change to the Articles have happened sooner rather than later? So maybe those conflicting viewpoints, maybe they were an impetus for the change. And then I put together a rubric that you might use that addresses criteria of critical reading, contextualization, and their ability to make a thoughtful, reasonable argument. Blank. Okay, so again, coming back to these really big issues that are coming up again and again that eventually lead to the realization that the Articles are too weak.
All right.
That's it.
And then when we move into lesson 2, you know, ideally your kids with the colonies game will have had an opportunity to discuss discuss how they might try to unite their colonies together into one colony here. But lesson 2 is where we stop focusing on the Articles of Confederation and start focusing on, hey, these didn't work so well, and bringing together the Constitutional Convention. So I start you off with a way of expanding the colonies game discussion here, because you could say to the kids when you begin lesson 2, you could say, you know, hey, that thing you guys have been working on, it's not working. So let's discuss some ways we could make that, let's discuss some ways that we can make that work a little bit better. It's here that the missing open book reading guide actually is, not in the first lesson. So you should be okay, because that will definitely be up. But it's also here that you might choose to read the first part of writing the Constitution. As long as whichever one of the 3 of you wins this promises that whenever you reference it, you'll do it just like that. Shh. You're writing the Constitution. Because it's fun. So this is where you may choose, especially in a year where you may have a little bit more time than you probably have this year. But this is a time you may choose to start reading or writing the Constitution book. Oh, yeah. That's a great photo.
Yeah.
Of me making fun of the person that shushed you.
Yes.
Good times. Good times. We'll tell you that story at break for anyone who wants to hear it. Honestly, the inside the convention, you know, the fact that it was July and 30,000 degrees and all of that is fun stuff, but it's not in a content expectation. So I give you a really quick way to go through it and acknowledge it before you get to the meat of what's actually in the content expectations. And we start off with the various plans. So I give you guys a graphic organizer that you can have the kids do via Google Docs, but then they're actually going to dig into what the Virginia plan was, what the New Jersey plan was, and then the Connecticut compromise or the Great Compromise. I leave it kind of to you to determine how you tackle these with the kids, but it's essentially about introducing this idea of big states wanting something that little states didn't and vice versa, and how all of that continued to play out through the Constitutional Convention. I also have the 3/5 compromise, which is called for by its own content expectation, in a section just a little bit later. It's up to you if you want to bring it into this discussion or if you want to treat it as its own standalone. I see some benefits of doing both, but I also see the benefit, especially after the last week, of clearly articulating that this content is here. So I made a note here that you could choose to bring in what's in step 5 that should read into this piece of it, should you wish. So just know you can skip ahead and bring that in or do it later. I then kind of want to wanted to walk kids through each of the various articles of the Constitution itself, which I sort of do with Article 1 in step 3. But then we get into, with step 4, the executive branch. It's up to you if you want to have your kids read the full Constitution. I guarantee you that if your district is using any of the open materials released by the state, that between 8th grade and high school civics, they will leave K-12 education having read the entire Constitution. It's up to you if you want to take your 5th graders through that. But at the very least, we give you things that can walk them through what's in each of those articles, and you can kind of pick and choose which ones you actually want them to take a look at.
I have a quick chat question.
Uh-oh.
So I clicked on the links like that.
Mhm.
So you only, is there a way,
They just need to make a copy.
okay, and then they can type in the box?
Yep, then they're able to type in the box. Yep. Or you can make a copy and push it out through Google Drive or, yep, exactly, yep. Getting you into the executive branch, one thing that I wish we all had more time to teach, so I kind of added it in here because some of the revised expectations talk about it a little bit more, getting into the idea of the cabinet. They don't necessarily hear about it again until 8th grade, and even then, it's primarily in the review piece. We don't really get into cabinet members and cabinet responsibilities in the rest of the course. It pops up more, again, in high school civics. So I gave you an entry point to talking about the cabinet, primarily from the fact that it started with 3 and we're up to how many? 12?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's obviously, it's grown over time. But you can use this resource to go as far into it or as not far in as you want to go. The other piece that tends to get overlooked because it's complicated and we all hate it, well, we all have strong opinions on it. Some people hate, some people love. The idea of the Electoral College, I brought the Electoral College in here, and this is something that is, it's an incredibly fun rabbit hole that is very well linked to the content expectations here. If you've never seen 270 to Win, it's a great interactive electoral map that you can take the kids out to. Some of the past high school civics questions actually have this map embedded. In some cases, we've embedded a map that we've created. In others, we ask them to create it and then explain. So it's really neat, kind of robust site where you can flip a state any color you want, and then it keeps track up here of who's got what.
The other piece that we may want to consider adding, Dave,
Mhm.
and I just saw it and I'm trying to find it again. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's a US map, and it is kind of what the impact of each state with regard to the Electoral College. And you see that, Michigan and Wisconsin are
1 millimeter by 1 millimeter about as far as the impact when you take a look at how the electoral votes are kind of divvied up, if you will. And it's very, very powerful because kids quickly can look at that and get a sense of some of the issues that come along with that magic formula. So I'm trying to find that to put in.
Perfect.
As
The other thing that you can do is pull up a historical map for every election that we have data for. And there's actually a page here. Did I link it in here? Yes, I did. Because I found it and then I lost it and then I couldn't find it again. You can do it from that view that I was just on, but this is a more powerful way of doing it. Because you can actually see there were some elections where I would call some of the elections that we're looking at here landslides. I would not call others landslides, but if I just had to pick one, looks like 1984. Yeah, there may have been some directive that voters went to the polls with that year that made that map essentially be all red, according to the electoral votes. Another one that I like to reference is in the midst of the Great Depression, 1932, 1936. This is the one that overturned Hoover. That seems like a pretty clear directive as well.
Swings as the polls.
What's that?
As the polls.
Yep. 64. That's another one that outside of, this is an interesting map from the perspective of what had these 5 states ticked off?
Yeah.
And why was Arizona with them? Or was Arizona with them? So you could even choose to pull up some of this historical data and kind of go through it with kids there too and kind of ask them, what is this? One of the first questions they might have the closer you get down here is, why are the colors different down here? Which is, of course, different political parties, but. So 270 to win is a rabbit hole, but it's a fun rabbit hole and it's a relevant rabbit hole. So if you've got some time with your kids, show them the site. Show them the site. And when we get to our next election year, pull it up earlier in the year. Then we talk a little bit about the judicial branch, and the thing I'm going to highlight here is the iCivics piece. iCivics is really for upper grades more than it is the elementary, but I've had elementary teachers that have had great success doing iCivics games as a whole class activity. Again, it's going to depend from year to year based off of your kids, but there's one game in particular, as you're talking about the Supreme Court, that I recommend trying to play with your whole class together, and that's Supreme Decision, so I'd link that there. Then we get into the 3/5 compromise and the slave trade compromise before ending lesson 2. With lesson 2 ending, we then, so we've established a new, we've established this, but lesson 3 gets into the Bill of Rights. And so with the Bill of Rights, again, the content expectation that's the current law of the land only asks you to take a look at the first 4 amendments to the Constitution. No conversation about the first 4 amendments should be complete without the 6 that came after them. So I have given you guys tools and resources to be able to go through all of them with kids. My hunch is a lot of you kind of touch on all of them anyway. A little bit of a nod in here to Amendment 10, so you can have a discussion with kids about what it means, what it doesn't mean, what they think it means. And then, again, this is only the second time this year I've thrown a John Green crash course video in there, and it's not intended to introduce anything new, because as a lot of you have rightly pointed out, he's hard to follow when you're trying to get new nuggets of information, but if you're looking for validation, he's pretty much covered everything in this video that the lesson covers as well. So it's a good kind of review before you move into the final piece of the 5th grade, which is, drum roll please, coming from Dr. Gershmel, which is the where do we put the capital activity. Now, I'm going to let him get set up, so we're going to take a break. And during that break, the three of you can put your names in that bin, and I will do a random draw so that one of you can leave here tonight with your very own, barely used copy of Reading the Constitution. All right,
How long do you want us for break?
let's say 7 minutes, because that puts us at 6 exactly.
Perfect.
Excellent. 7-minute break. I'm not going to stop sharing. Do you have a yellow one from over there?
But you, this one's looking fun. Okay.
I'm going to put it behind my back and throw them on the floor and then pick one up anyway. But
Okay.
a little easier if I'm like, oh, purple versus 2 yellows. All right, we're going to raffle this off and then I'm going to turn it over to Phil. I folded them all into squares. All of the squares are going to get thrown into the air like confetti. And I'm going to turn around and pick up. Kelly, you're the winner. Here you go. Welcome. Enjoy and use in your class. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Gershmel, Dr. G. Dr. Phil, he loves it when you call him that. He doesn't.
So there is a PowerPoint. And you can use it or not use it as you see fit. In fact, there's 3 PowerPoints. There's an introduction. And what I think I do is model not using it, and then show it very quickly at the end of it. And just kind of orally say, you know what's weird about our capital is that most countries, they put their capital in the middle of the country. In most states, they put the capital kind of in the middle. In fact, we've moved it from Detroit to Lansing in order to get it closer to the middle. And we've got our capital not only way on the edge, but way on the edge where you can take a boat right up to it. And as a result, our capital got burned to the ground several times by enemies that came in here. And isn't that kind of crazy? How do we ever decide where to put that thing? Now, the question about where to put the capital is the one that they couldn't even figure out how to work out a compromise during the time when they were doing it. And they kicked that can down the road. And they said, we'll worry about this after we get going. And you might want to couch it in those terms that they had fought so hard over the slavery issue and the voting issue and the question about big states and small states and how does representation work. They were just out of gas. It was like being vague. And they just couldn't make a decision, and they said, we're going to have to decide sometime in the future. Now, there are 2 myths, and I'm still talking kind of not as the model of it. Myth number 1 is that it really came down to Thomas Jefferson, you know, trying to figure out how to do it, inviting Alexander Hamilton to join him for dinner, and we're going to work this out. And that's a lovely story. It's just baloney. It's true that they had dinner. And it's also true that they came out of it early speaking to each other. And then thought about it for a little while. Now, I think both of them are heroic in their own way. But that's neither here nor there. The other myth is the more serious one. And that's the myth that says, back in the old days with the founding fathers, they were able to compromise, and we're just not able to compromise in the same way today, and oh, isn't things terrible right now? And, you know, we become these tribes. And like I say, I sense that all over the country, that little notion that things were somehow better in the old days. The third thing is, what do you do in May to kind of review the year? And it turns out, if you don't think about this question about where to locate the capital until that way again, and you realize that the people in Congress kicked that can into the future a little ways, it gives us a golden topic to review the whole course. So that's what this activity is about, and actually we shamelessly stole it from a group called Mission Geography back in the 80s. And then this thing has been updated. I bet this activity has been run by 20,000 teachers in about 30 different states. And we keep modifying it on a little bit. Now, at the end of this, I'm going to give everybody everything. But right now, you're only going to get a couple maps. I'm going to assume you don't need the map about locating the capital. What is the question? It's just, we've had 15 cities that wanted to be the capital. And this puts down what those cities are. My thought is to just leave that lying on the table there. The second page is the map where they actually have to answer some questions about which colony was the farthest north. In other words, we're going all the way back to the very beginning about what's the basic place name location. And every kid probably either has to have this in their head or you want to give them a copy of this because they're going to need it for the third one and for the rest of these maps. And here you can make them into groups, but then number very carefully so that they work out pretty well. If you give one group maps number 2 and 6, and the next one 3 and 7, the maps get a little bit difficult as you go up from 2 through 9, and they also get a little bit later in the year. In other words, number 2 is just about the basic landforms about, and so on. So the thought is, we will give this group maps 2 and 6. I just lay them on the table there. And I don't know, you can count on it, it's 3 and 7. And who wants to be the loner and who wants to be the team here? Anyway, Aaron, you do a couple of these. Each one of these pages has got a specific math skill that allows you to review whether the kids have the math skill. And it has a specific kind of information. Your job is simply to work your way through the map and based only on the information on that map, decide where you would put the capital. Okay? And I'll give you about, I don't know, 6 or 7 minutes. Spend about 4 minutes on each of your 2 maps. Probably 3 for the lower number and 4 minutes for the higher number. Just glance over this. I deliberately gave you a blank page like this because one of your jobs is to mark up that map using the markers that you put in the box in there so that you can stand up and hold it and show it to everybody afterwards, okay? And then you say, based upon this information, I think the capital ought to be located at blank. And actually, let me put a couple of these out. Now, when you're doing it in class, you're going to be wanting to walk around and see if the kids figure this out. But I'm going to definitely go to the next room and see what the third grade group is doing for about 5 minutes here. And then I shall be back.
They don't want us. They're just there to take it. Six. Oh.
Well, we have school.
This is awesome. I was really impressed with somebody to give me something too high and at the there's a big category. See the negative or the difficult thing. The positive. And then this one is part of the United States. I chose Virginia because they're self-sufficient, so they would have both production and exporting. So they have the best picture of it.
Like I said, we're gonna keep playing up and trying to make it fix.
I have some from you as well.
Yeah.
I have a couple of those in mind, right?
It's the rationale for this.
Do we have people in offsites here?
Yep. Alicia.
How are you guys doing on finishing up maps at the offsites?
Where's my?
Oh,
Thank you.
sorry. Thank you.
This year's kids, private schools.
Yeah.
But
Okay,
It
yeah.
should just not be.
Yeah, it will. Yep.
Straight line.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
That one's bigger, isn't it, Lee? Right.
Brian, were you here for everyone?
I did.
Okay. All right. Because if you didn't, I was going to have you go back and sign some of the sheets.
No.
Okay.
She would not have had you sign previous sheets. That would not be a thing that,
I bet hearing.
yeah.
Well, I remember seeing you at every one.
I would,
Just, yeah.
Okay, let's go through the set. Or not. Okay? So let's go through the set, and it's like, we are now in Congress. And we're gonna try to convince each other based on the information that we have. Note to teachers, that if you actually look at the transcripts of some of the debates there, every one of these topics did come up. And if you stop and think about it for a little while, they were sitting in a fairly sweaty office room in the summertime saying, wherever we're gonna put the Capitol, it's not gonna be in a place that's too hot and it's all like this because it's just too hard to work and we're tempered straight. And somebody else immediately pointed out, we gotta be in a place where we can get there. Anyway, somebody took every one of these seriously. To the point where some of them, that was their main criteria. So let's go through that. Whoever's got that too, you don't have to, right? Stand up, explain to me what you think is going on in the country here, why this is important.
I define fall zones. I think fall zone is an important feature, area of rapids and waterfalls associated with the geological boundary between the flat coastal plains and the Piedmont. Piedmont is a French word for the foot of the mountain. So I was instructed to locate all the towns that are fall zone towns. Augusta, Columbia, Georgetown, Pawtucket, Philly, Raleigh, Richmond, and Trenton. And I had to figure out what the other 6 towns were. Being Boston, Hartford, DC, New York City, Charleston, Savannah, the other ones down there. And Albany as well. Said 6. So looking at it, DC is a long fall zone where many of the other ones, my observation, not necessarily.
So where are you gonna put the Capitol?
DC. Yeah. What they've decided. With that though, it's harder to get ships in with the rapid and it's harder to pack, even though you're closer to the coast.
Okay. Any questions for the person that was all concerned about whether you could get ships there and whether you could use that site to have a local economy of some kind, which meant you had to have some kind of ability to saw wood, to build houses, to mill grain. And he's saying probably District of Columbia is the best combination of those 2 factors. Is that what I hear you say? Okay, you were looking at the weather.
Yes, so I have climate graphs and I have the monthly average temperature. So there's 12 dots. The dots that are above the top line on each graph represent room temperature, 68 degrees or higher. And then below the bottom line is freezing. So they were looking for the city with the most moderate temperature, or the most comfortable temperature, not to be too hot or too cold so that they could actually work in the capital. And so if you add up the hot months and the cold months, or the ones that are too hot and too cold, and find the least drastic city, it comes out as Boston. So I would recommend Boston as for the capital, according to the climate.
Okay. And that was map 3, map 4.
4 was based on population. And you had to draw a line right in the middle of where the most population was. So it's the south. Right,
Okay. So this is deliberate. That was the easy one, and then when they got at the high end of it, really
Yeah.
uses up some time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have 5, and
Okay.
that's kind of to do with population. So, but it had a cluster in categories of large, medium, small, it was a good category.
Cluster what in categories?
Population, size of cities, large,
Okay.
medium, and small. So you gotta interpret it, didn't give you a code, you gotta interpret from small to large.
Okay.
So I just did this one by myself, but there's a lot of small. I went with single digits, thousands, in the teens, with the medium-sized town, and then above, there are 2 big, New York and Philadelphia, big.
Okay.
So now I have to recommend this back.
Yeah, and then based on the information of that.
Well, I would lean a little bit towards Philadelphia. It's the most, the southernmost big city, but I'd also look at a middle-sized people
Okay.
from just the span. Maybe Baltimore, I'd say.
Now, of all the topics that we've had so far, I tended to be a little bit, you know, of what you're familiar with, so that some people would like the warmer days, and then other people knew how to deal with the snow and so on like this. But this is one that got to be controversial. Because you said, you know, I wanted in a big city. What percentage of the population at the time do you think would have been satisfied with a capital in one of the biggest cities around?
Probably not too many.
And it's so far north, right?
Okay.
And Charleston's a medium, you know, representation.
Yeah.
Right.
But Charleston was a medium size, and we'll give you a handout a little bit later on about the population growth over time like this, because Charleston had already reached its peak. Till the Civil War, it didn't grow at all. You know, it was the most important city in the South. The South hated cities. And the North was very happy with it. So that one was likely to be controversial, and you named 2 possibilities.
Yeah, the other big city, New York and Philadelphia.
Okay. Okay. Now, map 5, map 6.
I had the population of enslaved people, the percentage per state or territory. And it wanted you to color percentage of population held as slaves and color code each states. And then I had to fill in the graph. And then we had to draw a line, horizontal line, between the many slave states and the slave states. The number was 10. So all of these states had less than 10% of an enslaved population. Delaware down had more than 10. And then they wanted you to draw a line, and then you had to draw a line on the map. And I'm going to say that, and it said that the southern states would have preferred the capital to be in the south so that they could be slaves. And I would say that Washington D.C. was, you know, pretty close to the border of that line. And so that would have been one of the better cities. It was still in the south, but it was close enough to the border where the further states were.
Okay. Any questions for that? So the next one you got?
7. Major products: indigo, rice, tobacco, wheat, iron, and ships. And it had where they were produced or grown on the maps. And the question on this one was, what state should the capital be in or near? And you can tell the export states that specialize in exporting goods. You can tell the states that need to import goods. And so I chose Virginia or North Carolina because they were self-sufficient for export, and they seem to have a variety which would give the capital the most, I guess, feel as to how the economy would go.
Question?
Well, this one links to that.
Yes.
That's the number 8, we should have probably talked to put that together. So this showed, and it's not old really, but it showed some of the states here with imports and exports, and then the difference. And the North, let's see, the Pennsylvania is really, Pennsylvania imports way more than they export. So they're dependent on that. And we're talking about taxing goods and so forth. But Maryland and Virginia are almost, they do a lot of both. Whether thicker going in and out, a lot of trade, but it's equal imports, equal exports. And then there's just a little bit going down and stuff. Probably us together, we're much in the middle there.
Right.
Probably mine would say Maryland, Virginia. Yeah.
Okay, now if your students say these things are right next to each other, what's a question that you could use to kind of tease them apart a little bit? He had one more consideration that you didn't have available, right? You only had how much?
Yeah.
You didn't have amounts. He had whether he had the product mix and whether you could actually feed yourself.
Right. We needed that.
Yeah. So
So they
you guys,
purposely divided that one up. So that it wasn't together. Did you purposely separate?
I purposely separated them, and if I were doing it, I would put them as far apart in the room as I could, so that they would come up with it, and then it lets you do it. But you notice what we're doing is that each one of these is reviewing something that we were doing early on, so that gives you a chance to, by the way you phrase the question, to diagnose whether they got the idea about the regional differences in climate and whether they got the idea about the product specializations that were happening in these particular places. Because then we get to the real tour de force, the one thing that Jefferson and Hamilton had to hammer out.
Looks like you're talking about yield.
Okay,
And,
tune it up so that,
I'm sorry, looks like they're looking at a deal based on war debt. If you took the entire war debt and spread it between everyone in America at that time, the cities and places with higher populations had a greater share of the war debt. And so they were kind of saying a deal, if you'll let the capital be farther away from you, we'll absorb some of that debt. Is that understanding?
I don't know.
That's what it looked like to me. Is that what you guys understood? So then you're looking at the data for each state, looking at the population and the load of debt they have. So you can see who has the bigger load and might more likely say, yes, you can remove it farther from us for this deal. I'll just for an example. The biggest one by the bigger city. So, but yes. Well, I don't know, maybe either.
Okay. Now, we're a relatively small group, and I wanted to run this part fairly efficiently. But if you're doing it in the class, this presentation part is going to require some props, and that's where you wind up, with a big map like this. And we've got a whole bunch of stuff over on the side there. We were going to make that an optional near the end of this because we made a couple summary activities that involve moving some of these props around on a big map of this size. But you know that you can take, a big map like this and you can mark it up with a vis-a-vis marker or something like that. They're also all on the 3 PowerPoint presentations. And again, I'm just going to show them fairly quickly until you stop me with a question or a comment on it. And then we'll do a debrief a little bit later on. So let me, especially since I've got to be way off in the corner here, the way you might set it up is with the setup PowerPoint. And so it just says, this is how you could set this thing up. The year is 1790, the Constitution has just been adopted, and we have, at some pain, hammered out a couple compromises, the things that he was talking about. Now, we could have done the same activity for those two compromises. The problem is, it is difficult enough to talk about the adoption of the Constitution and so on without adding the regional differences to it. So we were kind of deliberately punting the regional differences into the future. Does that make sense? It's like, just talk about government for a while. Get the government down cold, because if you talked about the regional differences, about the 3/5 compromise and so on like this, in other words, if you went ahead and made that map of slavery at the 3/5 compromise, you just stretch out that discussion to the point where it's harder to teach. And so the idea is to do that fast. And then to say, let's look at something that we could have been doing all along, but now we're going to be making a decision that actually is going to set the stage for the Civil War. In other words, it's not only summarizing 5th grade, it's pointing toward 8th grade. It's saying, this is the thing that the way we solve this actually set us up for the Civil War. So you could introduce it, like I say, running through the PowerPoint here, and it summarizes what these compromises were. The 3rd compromise is desperately needed. Well, we just couldn't sort that out when we were writing out the Constitution. Where should we put the capital? Popular history books tell you this interesting story about how Thomas Jefferson had dinner and they worked this all out. That seems a little bit too easy. Did it really work that way? And let's just keep that story in mind and take a look at the geography of the country. We'll use ideas from geographic analysis to explain why the compromise worked out the way it did. It might show us why this compromise eventually led to the Civil War a little bit later on. So each group is going to get some maps. Each map has some instructions, and then this just goes through and says, one of you gets this, and you have to ask the question about which one of these cities is actually in a place where it could be somewhat self-sufficient. And another person gets this climate map, and another, Now, I don't know if you want to show these pictures early on so that they know what each other's have right at the beginning, or if you want to do it the way I did it, where you don't know for sure what other people are working on. I don't think I'm going to answer that question. Now, if you try it out and you do it a particular way and you decide it worked pretty well, email me, okay? We'll put those notes in there. But we ran this with a lot of teachers in New York, and the fact is some of them went through a PowerPoint like this and others didn't. So they tried to choose it. Spoiler alert, at least one delegate used each one of these kinds of information. So it's for real, and then finally you get together and decide. There is a teacher packet. And I will zip over to what the teacher packet looks like, assuming that I can find my So that's kind of what you ought to have come up with for these numbers here. And one of the things you realize is what he said is that we've actually got two places that are reasonably benign. One of them is coastal Boston. And there was a group of people that wanted to keep the capital there in Boston. And another ones were the ones that were roughly in the middle here. It was very easy for almost all of the Northerners to reject anything south of about Washington, D.C. And it was fairly easy for most of these delegates to say it wasn't going to be. So the Boston people didn't get very far. Because there were these folks down here that just thought everything north of Virginia is going to be uninhabitable. So that came up about there. Those were where they probably would come up with for the fall zone towns. And of all those fall zone towns, Baltimore and Washington, D.C. were the two that were not only on a fall zone so that they would have a waterfall, so they would have a good mill, so they could saw wood cheaply and they could mill flour cheaply and so on. But they were also the two that had access to the ocean. That these guys down here, while they are on the fall zone, they're also way upriver. And these guys up here are actually fall zone cities. You know, Pawtucket, New York are fall zone cities. There's a waterfall there. But like I said, they've already decided that those weren't going to work for climate. Population, we kind of pushed them to do a graph. And part of this, I want to say it just one more time and then we'll leave it at that. Part of this is to have a different map skill and a different graph skill for these different ones to give you a chance to diagnose one last time who just didn't get it when we were talking about bar graphs back then. You know, gives you one last chance to take a look at it. So you might strategically hand out different maps to the people that you're wondering whether they've got it. In other words, if somebody's been having trouble with graphing like this, then you give them one of these activities that involves some graphing. And like you said, you give that number 9 to the one that's been giving you trouble all along because they think they know everything. And that will make them think twice, right? In any case, about the middle of the population looks about right there, and you drew a line that was just about right there. You notice what's happening here? That virtually all of these lines are coming in exactly the same place here. That is the big difference between the politics of that day and the politics of today. That if I took 6 issues today, let me just think of some, climate change, trade, immigration, abortion, are we going to have this where regardless of where you come from, you're going to come up with the same answer? And yet, when Jefferson and Hamilton came up with that last compromise, everybody else just said, fine, works for me.
We're bigger now.
Huh?
We're bigger now too.
And we're a lot bigger now.
Now we're bigger.
And so you say, you know, is it really that we just don't know how to compromise anymore? Or is it that compromise in general is going to be harder when you've got 300 million people as opposed to 4 million and scattered all over a big territory here? And how do we address the problems that we've actually got instead of blaming ourselves for not being as good as the founding fathers were or whatever? Anyway, that's kind of underneath the current here. If you look at classifying these things into the groups over here and deciding what the groups might be, one of the things that you want them to get out of both that one and the one that she was doing is that whenever you see a map, somebody had to make a decision about the groups. You know, somebody had to decide what colors am I going to use for particular. Somebody said, what's a big city, what's a medium size, what's a small one? But it also gives them some little idea about where the political clout was at the time. You know, where was the population when it came time to vote for a president? Which states, which cities, so on. Slater, you drew a graph that looked like that. In fact, I don't even need to show this one here. And you pick colors that look something like that. And one of the problems of this being such an easy decision right here is that it set up a regional difference that just persisted all the way up to the Civil War. It's like we didn't really answer the question about is 3/5 the right number for a slave. We just kind of accepted it, you know, and went along with it. In other words, you kicked the can forward about 60 years, but you didn't solve the regional difference problem.
But when the capital was further north, would that have changed history?
Sorry?
If you would have moved the capital would have been further north, would that have changed history or not?
Yeah, if we would have put the capital in either Charleston or Boston or New York, I suspect that secession discussion would have started a lot sooner, because they would have been sitting up here in almost a silo, you know, that not getting information here. But when that was there, they would get information, you know, it was available from both sides. The next one looks something like trade, and it is really very striking how dramatic the trade deficit was up here and how small the trade surplus was here. In other words, we have been a net importing country more or less forever. And that has not changed today. So people are complaining every once in a while, you know, well, it's terrible. We got this horrible trade deficit with China. Well, we've had a horrible trade deficit with the rest of the world just about forever. Probably not bad for us to have in the back of the mind. Actually drawing the arrows of what they look like in and out.
That's
Here-
tricky for a fifth grader to do, though. I think that would be tough for a fifth grader.
That will be tough. That will be tough. And one of the problems is that want to try to measure it exactly. And Carol and I have a kind of a hero, a husband and wife team at the University of Wisconsin who did a map book together, and she wrote a little poem to go on the front of the map book. And the poem reads the following: to tell the truth by lying with bold hyperbole of form and line. That if you want a map to communicate, you have to exaggerate. And your advice for the person doing that one is make it dramatic. If it's a skinny line, make it a skinny line. If it's a fat line, make it a fat line. Just like you did when you picked really bold colors. And had you not done that, I would have said, are they really going to be able to tell it? You know, in other words, I would have diagnosed that had you not picked really bold colors. But the advice gave you, you know, to pick the bold colors. But this is a lot of trade going in and out. This is a lot of people making money as longshoremen, as bankers, and you know, and all the other things that go on in ports, fine restaurants, whatever. And this is a really tremendous imbalance up here. And that becomes even more dramatic with that last one. And again, the idea is that they calculate the debt. The clue that you need to give this student if they're actually having trouble with this. And like I say, this map number 9, I would give to your 2 students who have been all year long telling you that they know everything. And I would give them this one to wrestle with for a little while. And if they wrestled with it and they were still baffled, you'd have to say, do you really need all of the information that's on that table? Because the truth is, what you need is, what's my debt and what's my fair share? All the middle column is the reason for the fair share. In other words, the fair share is your population. But you really don't need the middle column. And when you do that, then it's fairly easy. You know, 10.5 minus 9.2 is 1.3.
I was just looking at my New York, so
9.6.
and then if you go across to New York, here says 6.6. This paper says 9.6, 340, and 7.
Where did I make a mistake?
No, but it says New York 6.6 on yours, ours says 9.6.
Ah,
Under the other way.
yeah, okay, and yes, and that's right.
This one is right, okay,
And that's not, yeah.
okay.
That particular slide, it was the second year we were in New York, right? So just like about every, just about like every teacher, I've got stuff hanging around that's been there forever. What do? I call it a teachable moment, you know, then you congratulate the person that found the problem. Then you quickly go on to the next one here. And what does that map look like? And what that map really shows is that you've got that same line right there between the people that had borrowed more. Partly because they were fighting more up there. In other words, there was more battles going on up here. And as you remember, South Carolina was the one state down here that had a lot of battles in it. And it also has the smallest surplus here. And then you've got these really big ones here. But this is what Jefferson was able to trade in order to get the capital located right next to Virginia. That I will trade for giving all your debts in exchange for you putting the capital in Virginia rather than in southern Pennsylvania. Because he absolutely didn't want it in southern Pennsylvania. Why not? Like Philadelphia. Not want it in Philadelphia.
Trade?
Hmm?
Not good trade? Is there not a good way to get out to trade or not? Like anything, no, I don't know.
Why would somebody like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson absolutely not want the capital in Philadelphia?
Virginia.
Huh?
They're from Virginia.
They're from Virginia. But, you know. Let's go back to the religious geography of this country. What was the Quakers, which were strict abolitionists? Slavery is immoral, it is a sin, it is wrong. Put the capital in a place where they begin with the concept that, so this was a really big concession on the part of the Virginian. You know, we're gonna just cancel your debt to keep that capital out of Pennsylvania, out of that place where they would forever be trying to get rid of slavery. We want this thing down here. And then they finally had to put it on neutral ground, and then they finally said, we can't even settle for being neutral ground. We're not even gonna put it in the state. We're gonna make it its own district. And it's gonna be separate completely. But that was the big compromise. The point of the activity is that when they came up with that compromise, those few people who really cared about it, everybody else, no matter what their concern was, kind of agreed with it. You know, it's in the middle, it's on the fall zone, it's got a good climate, it'll work.
I'm just trying to make sure I understand that. I'm slow. Like, you're saying each state accrued different debt because of the fighting that occurred there, more or less, right?
Yeah.
And then the population, it gets spread amongst their population. So those northern states have a greater debt load per person because there was more fighting, correct?
I'm not sure I would make it that fight. That certainly contributed to it.
Why is it less? I'm not sure why there's a little bitty. Well, let's closer to. Yeah, I understand why like something that it looks so small. There's a lot of fighting there, especially.
Yeah, because I don't think a lot of fighting was the only part of debt. I think trade deficit is part of that. And I think just having lived in New York, this is easy for me to say, it's just the notion that the right to be in debt. That bankers tend to like the notion of debt, you know, and credit card companies, all this kind of thing. Whereas when I grew up in Wisconsin, you didn't want to go into debt at all, you know? I mean, it just was wrong.
They're importing a lot more.
But that ties into Hamilton's philosophy, though.
Huh?
Hamilton liked that.
That's
So
right.
he used to try to get the national debt.
So and those cleavages still exist in our society today. You know, New Yorkers still think it's just fine, you know, that when the market collapses like this, what do we bail out first? The banks. And they didn't really care about anything else at all. One of the scary things is you take a look at Secretaries of the Treasury and they've all been Goldman Sachs executives, the Morgan Stanley executives. In other words, they know how to play the game of being concerned for what they're concerned about. The point of this activity is, this is not a disease of Goldman Sachs in the year 2008. This has been the mindset of New York since colonial times, that debt is all right, that manipulating debt is a way of promoting growth. We used to have this debate about the two ends of the Erie Canal, because the New Yorkers would all say the Erie Canal was important because it allowed Eastern capital to invest at the frontier. And you come over here to Michigan, and they say the Erie Canal was important because it gave entrepreneurs in Michigan access to the market. See that difference? New Yorkers think that the Erie Canal allowed brilliant New Yorkers to make investments in places like Michigan and Illinois. And here we say it allows us to do our hard work and get rewarded by being able to ship it easily into the ocean. And I submit that that cleavage exists in our political discourse today. And nowhere clearer than in the collapse of the 2008 banking crisis. And, you know, in New York, and we were there at the time, it would have been unheard of to say, oh, the way to solve this problem is just to forgive every mortgage. But you know, forgiving everybody's mortgage would cost half as much as the way we solve the problem, which is bail out banks. It would have cost less federal dollars to forgive everybody's mortgage. Yeah. So, like I say, that cleavage exists. And one of the things that we want kids to begin to understand is there are good geographic reasons for cleavage within the political scene that we've got right now. And one of those is an urban-rural. One of them is a debt, not debt. And a big cleavage is slave-no slave. And that one has not been solved either. We still have people talking about reparations, right? That we should pay everybody who proved that one of their grandparents was a slave. And maybe we should. So, like I say, this activity can be one day, or it can stretch out over a couple weeks. As a couple weeks activity, it can do a lot of our jobs of reviewing what we did earlier about what were the specialties of different regions, what are the differences in climate care, what's the population pattern there. In other words, we can use this activity to do a lot of review. We can also argue with the math teacher that we're doing some of your clicks for you by doing, you know, we need a few more minutes for this activity because, and if you're in a self-contained classroom, you've just got yourself a whole stack of nice little math reviews. In other words, you might not want to break them up into groups. You might want to have everybody do the graphing one. And then separate them into separate groups. If they have trouble with data tables, 3 of these involve working with the data tables. One of them has got a very complicated graph. You've got to count dots along whole lines. It's a weird kind of graph, but it is a kind of graph.
Bill, I have a question about the slave population.
Yeah.
Was that the actual slave population or the prefix
This is
version?
actual slave population.
Actually slave.
And you remember the clickable has got a enslaved population and a regular population layer on it. So you can put total population out by putting both those layers on. And then you can click off the regular, you know, the non-slave people and see where the slaves were and so on. And the other thing is, so you notice that there are some slaves up in New York and places like that.
Where would we find, we don't have a 7 map though. Where would we find it?
Student portals.
Or is it in the teacher resource?
Student portals, and I just have to apologize on behalf of the software company. The software that he is using is a beta version, and for some reason that nobody quite understands, he can tell it better like this. The problem with some student portals is stuff has been uploaded and it sits at the software company and doesn't actually get implemented.
What?
So that you should ask a question about the student portal for lesson 7 here.
Yes. There is no student portal for lesson 7.
Yes, but he was just saying, go find the clickable map. and display
Well, the clickable
content.
map was the way back one.
Oh, okay.
Clickable map is in the teacher lesson plans.
Okay.
I was gonna say, that if you decide to make this
Or it will
activity a little longer
It
than
will
2
be.
days, then you probably want to have the clickable map because it will let you dissect his map a little bit more detailed with the different products. In other words, if you want to make this a little longer than 2 days, then you can use it to review a lot of these earlier topics using that clickable. Or having individual kids make maps of individual products and show them. Like I said, I will give you every one of these. We also know that there is a lot of commentary that I was making here, and that is all written up so that there's actually that much about each one of these maps in the teacher's guide here. Which has all kinds of little things that you could say, you know, little enrichment things, much more than I've said so far. It also mentions things that you want to watch for. It says literally, look for the realization that the station, that the influence of the city extends a certain distance out. In other words, the teacher's guides are a little elaborate here. And there's a third PowerPoint that I won't bother to show that actually looks in more detail to each one of these graphs and has a few commentaries on it. I'm not going to recommend that PowerPoint real highly. Definitely, you don't want to show that one to the kids. That's just background for you. Just like you probably don't want to try to cover every point that's in that teacher's guide. The point of the teacher's guide is to give you some interesting things to say about each map. In the event the students don't bring it up themselves, the ideal situation is they bring it up. In other words, he sits there and he infers, like you did, from the product to the climate. You know, the weather was long enough that we could grow these things in some of these areas. Okay? Now, officially, we can stop this now because I'm at the end of that one, and I don't think you've got anything more, right?
I do not.
Unofficially, if you want to stick around for a little while, I brought along a handful of props over here, and we've got 2 more activities. One of them is chasing a spy. And it's an activity that you can use on a floor map or some big map like this, where it literally is giving them a handful of clues about it. And we can just model that for a while. We'll lay the map out here, and we'll chase a spy around. And another one of the activities is just about places on the big map. And that's how you notice up there I've got a big blue and a medium-sized blue and a little one, and it would be like the biggest French settlement in North America, and then the medium-sized one, and then the little one, and the red for the British. And they could put these on here. Like I say, come May, my general impression is they need to get a little more physical in the class more often than earlier on. And so we put together a handful of things that you can do with a big map, and we can just lay this out and talk about some of them. And then where do you get the big map? Well, this here one is brand new.
You wrapping it out today?
Huh?
You wrapping it out today?
I'm offering to raffle off one of these, and then we can figure out how to get it. And I've also, you know, one of the questions, of course, is this too big for your room? And my thought is, I don't know. This is a good combination of, in a particular school, the third graders can use it and put it on the floor, and you can put it on the wall or lay it on a table somewhere like this. But in any case, there's a great big United States map, and I'm going to just kind of lay it out over here and emphasize the East Coast over here. And if you want to stick around, if you want to take off right now, we can take off. If you want to stick around, we can chase a spy around here for a little while with some clues. So up to you. If you want to be around here, gather around the table. after I get to this. Here's all your data.
So is this your wife, Carol?
Yes.
How much does that cost?
This one, if we can order a number of these, it's under $50, it's like 42 or something like that plus postage. And we can make it in a smaller size at about $30, which would be off about a foot off each way. This thing is 4 by 6.
He makes it. And then the least expensive place we found is in North Western Minnesota, where nobody lives.
It's a brilliant economic geography example because it's in a lake district of Minnesota. It means they're really crowded during hunting season, fishing season, summer when you can go up to your cabin and so on like
It's not
that.
a fancy lake
Not
area.
fancy at all.
It's not like the shore of Lake Michigan. It's a very rustic.
Like Antrim County or something like that, you know, one of these up there. And it's on the interstate. And it's not too terribly far from Fargo, which is a nice big, and so it's up there. And they just had a lot of surplus labor in the wintertime. They started making these banners for schools, for communities that would have, tomato festival day and hang up down the street. And slowly they got bigger and bigger machinery right now. And like I said, if I ordered one of these, it'd be about $90. But if I ordered 10 of them, I'd get down into the 48, something like that range. And I bought 5 of these, and I'm going to wrap up one of them here because people have shown up on this way.
What if have you ever had one that would take us to the Revolutionary War from the Mississippi and then blow that up a little bit bigger for our kids for 5th grade? Because we really go to the Mississippi after the war.
Yeah.
And it would be, because then all those counties are still so small, the Rhode Island and everything, you could get those even bigger. That 5th grade might have fun with that. Just our,
I agree. I think that's the hardest part is looking at the geographic features of Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Like you just can't see them when you're looking at all the colonies.
Yeah.
Right. Almost like your colony map.
But, yeah, colony.
Well, the colony map.
And I think that was one of the questions that we were going to ask is that we could take that base that you used for your game and for the clicker wall and make that as a banner.
Yeah.
And that.
Does that include the
Just be
Ohio territory?
No, that goes right to the Appalachian.
Yeah, that kind of
That's
diagram
South
right
Michigan.
here.
Yeah, it's got Michigan on it, but not, yeah.
Right. It doesn't go all the way to the Mississippi.
But quite honestly, that's,
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing is the question about in a school, do you get it for one grade or do you get something that you can use in multiple grades and pass it around among them?
Right.
And at that point, this becomes a real serious one for 5th grade, I think for 8th grade, and to some extent even for 7th, 6th, but.
But it would be nice to show the high mountains and the low mountains, and that way you'd see the valleys.
Yeah.
'Cause
You missed that on that.
I had to have lived in New York and made maps for year pictures to appreciate the significance of the Erie Canal.
oh, sure.
Michigan grew because of the canal, but it is so obvious where they put the Erie Canal. When you see the mountains, you are not going to go up or over mountains. And the kids just they themselves brilliant. Just to see that the valleys, they just and they are.
So there's some things that we've been able to find. Destroy myself here. Some things that we've been able to find and some things that are still hard to find. one of the things that surprises me is that it's hard to find just this strapping material. We've gone to fabric stores looking for something like this. It's just hard to find. So we wind up buying these 14-foot long
Belts.
like this. And then I lop off a number of these to be the right thing to match up perfectly with the scale of the map over there, so that each one of these lines is 100 miles apart. And of course, if we're going to chase a spy around and he's got an airplane and he can go 300 miles an hour, then we're going to need to have some ability to do some measuring on it. On the other hand, if your spy is on a horse and going only 20 miles a day, that's still useful. You can find out about where it is. So if you know where you can buy this strapping, let me know, because I've got quite a few of these already this long.
Don't tell them.
These numbers that I've been spreading off on the floor here, you know, that you use for magnets, are fairly useful, but they're expensive, and it's just preposterous how much they charge for little blocks.
And he saw us fool me. So what was he talking with? My best friend.
I thought it was the electric knife for the turkey.
Yeah, exactly. The bread knife is very, all of that kind of thing. The pool noodles turn out to be a remarkably inexpensive way to get a whole lot of markers that you use. And for chasing the spy around, is that we're doing exactly what the police department would do to chase a criminal of some kind. You know, we're going to come up with a map and we're going to mark where that person was observed with one symbol, like they've been observed over here like this, and we think they're going over to these over here, so they can be marking these over here, but the fact is you really don't need this, because I've done this with a towel map on the floor. And if you really want the cheapest possible map, just commit yourself to spending a tiny little bit of time with a projector on the wall over here. This is less than an hour.
Really?
He's got a system.
You throw it on the wall like this, you turn your projector on, you shine your projector on it, and you go over there and you draw. Now, this one, you know. And cutting out the states that we're going to have to use for part of this, as to where is the state that, you know, comes in two pieces. This was a proof of concept thing. How many states can I cut out from the templates that's going to be up on your, you know, you can download these. Yeah. So we've got all the outlines for all the states that actually fit, except for Texas, which we made half size. And then we just ignored Montana, Wyoming, and California, because we're not out there anyway like this. But these guys, I just managed to cut out about 12 of these states during half of Fareed Zakaria on, you know, you don't actually have to watch that show, it's just listening to it. So it's not prohibitively long. On the other hand, trying to get a fifth grader to cut these things out, I don't have that hand-eye coordination yet. So that isn't going to work. If you can't even afford a pool noodle, I am shocked at how many bottle caps two people can accumulate in a month.
I feel like you kids are going to get you saving these piles of stuff in the kitchen.
Yeah, so we're just you know, these are orange juice bottles like this, and I don't drink a whole lot of Dr. Pepper, but you could make these bottle caps. So we can do it with pool noodles, and then I've got a script about the spy that I'll give everybody about using the maps to catch a spy. The front part of this one just happens to be one script that I was using at the library with a mixed group. I had kids as young as 4 years old, and I had a couple sixth graders, and a whole range in between like that. So you wanted to have clues that people of different ability levels would be able to handle. And I got a bunch of clues on the front there, and then on the back there's just some suggestions for some additional useful clues. But we could probably brainstorm and think of about 5 more like that. So the question is, you're in the Situation Room of the CIA, and your job is to plan how to catch a spy. You do have a telephone that you can call people around the country, but there isn't going to be a spy in colonial times. Just because this one wasn't written up for colonial times, you can write it up and make it up for colonial times fairly easily. First of all, how does the map show the state borders, you know? That you might, if you've got a mixed group, go through what the symbols, how does it show the Great Lakes, how does it show cities, how does it show mountains, how does it show other things like that? The spy was last seen in Detroit, and Detroit is the largest city in Michigan, so y'all gotta stand up and come over here, you can't just sit in a chair.
While you're standing, guys, I'm headed out. I'm getting on the road to get back to Cadillac. It was an absolute pleasure. If you need anything, you know how to get a hold of me, and thank you.
What color is the whole needle?
Again, I would make that a teachable thing, that the student should choose the symbols that they want to use for something like this, because they've got to realize that somebody always makes that decision.
Oh, they were the
Thanks
spies.
for everything. We're signing off.
In Detroit.
They're signing off. She said, thanks for everything.
And it's the only state that's between two Great Lakes, if they need that clue. And I put a lot of these clues on here that you may or may not need. Yeah, that I know. So the problem is the spy has a plane, and you phoned up your agents, and the nearest agents to Detroit at the time were in Oakland County, because for some reason that I haven't figured out yet, Oakland County seems to have disproportionate clout in Michigan. The spy took off, and the flight plan said that he was heading toward a city about 300 miles away from Detroit, toward the west.
300 to the west, right?
And so,
Yeah, Chicago.
and just to be sure, what state is Chicago in?
Yeah.
How do you know?
We're getting out of Michigan now, so.
We're getting out of Michigan now. We're going to find out where they run out of their geography. That's how I like this. And so you had to put a marker headed towards Chicago like this. Your agent was following a helicopter. Unfortunately, helicopters go slower than the spy's plane. And by the time the agent got to Chicago, the spy had refueled and left. And you don't know exactly there because there's 3 airports in Chicago, and you went to the wrong one first. I mean, you can make it as complicated or as simple as you want like this. The air traffic controller said that the plane was going south. What country do you think the spy might be going to? Yeah, and there are labels so that they can label, like, you know, in the downloadable thing, you just print up the label and have them mark Mexico and Canada. And I've got those in an envelope over there, but at some point I don't want to have to clean up too much.
Yeah, you're good.
I should. The spy might be going toward this state.
Yeah.
And well, yeah, I mean, you know that, but they would have, you know, a map with the state names printed if you want, down from your downloadable like this, so that they could do this. You do want them to begin to attach shape names and so on. So just, is this a box or a boot or a pan or what is it? Yeah. And if they get to that idea that give a name to something, because we all know that everybody can remember what Italy looks like, and nobody can remember what Yugoslavia looks like. And it's because we haven't come up with a name for it. And so one of the things you want to do with the clues is slowly build their ability to differentiate bad names. You know, not making it too obvious or something like that. So the spy is heading down toward that, Louisiana. And you call up the field office in New Orleans, which is the biggest city in Louisiana, and they wait and they wait and they wait, and the spy never got there. And you think you might have stopped somewhere earlier than that. And I've got 2 states that look pretty similar to each other here. I'm trying to figure out which one he might have stopped at. Yeah. Yeah, and if you get the, you know, if he stopped in Ohio, then he wasn't exactly following the flight plan, but he stopped here in Arkansas. So you might want to put a marker saying that they didn't land down over there. So
they didn't land here.
And we're starting to get kind of cluttered up here. But you might want to leave some kind of marker on New Orleans to say, you know,
Yeah, one of those
although we
little
thought they
caps.
were coming there, they were,
One of those little caps, we don't think he can get there, right?
yeah.
So
And
just
like
put
I
something
say,
smaller down there, right?
and you can elaborate their symbolic vocabulary as they need it.
Because we don't know.
Or do you think that each color?
Or read that they've already been there and
This is a guess here, right? That, did we know she got it?
You know what that happens?
And what this has is also some questions in here, like what famous person comes from Arkansas? I would have done that earlier with what famous person comes, and this worked beautifully in the library a couple of years ago, because I had a statue of Obama.
Yeah.
Oh, kindergartners from Harlem knew about that.
Oh, sure. Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was a big deal, but to put where Obama was, you know, in other words, for the kids in Harlem, you were using their knowledge of Obama to teach Illinois. For the kids here, you might be using their knowledge of Illinois to teach Obama's location, things like that. Like I say, this is highly flexible as to what they got. By the time that they get to the one airport, literally, there's only one airport that ended there, and that was at Little Rock. This guy had already taken off, and they were heading west. And what city are we likely to be going to when we're going west?
Dallas.
Okay, so of the states that they're going toward, we think they might be, if somebody was flying around and they saw that plane and they thought they had the numbers there, you know, the uncertainty of some kind. They think they might be going to the smaller of those two states. And I want somebody to tell me what is it shaped like and how are you going to describe it? And then what do you call this part of it?
Panhandle.
Okay, so we've got a panhandle, and I actually had a model of that made, and I just might have read it here. As to what, name me a couple other states that have panhandles. That's one.
Maybe Idaho.
Yeah, but if the lungs depend, and in fact, this is Panhandle, Idaho, and this is the Panhandle of Florida. So now we're grouping the states into some categories, and they say, by this grade, they don't know where all the states are.
And why are they shaped the way they are?
And why are they shaped the way they are? You can begin to open up some of those questions. And I'm about that far over here. Another agent said that he landed in a rectangular state that is split in half with mountains on half of it.
Colorado.
And what's the big city in the middle of Colorado? And so we got this far. And we think now he's no longer going to Mexico.
And west.
He's heading west somewhere. In fact, he's heading toward a state that has 3 of the biggest cities in the entire country in it. And so we write somewhere in there. You see how this, so we're down at the bottom of the page.
Are they reading or are you standing there kind of guiding them through it? Are you, as a teacher, are you reading through it?
I'm
You're
basically
giving
going down through this one
Right.
because where this really starts to be useful is the next step here. You say, I got a whole lot more questions that we could ask, but I want to split the group up here right now and think of the clues. In other words, for them to be thinking of the clues, and you say,
Sure.
you can't use the same kind of clue twice in a row. So one of them has to be shape and one has to be distance. And
Direction.
what are all the different ways we can make clues? One has to be topography, one has to be size, one has to be direction. And you get them to think about all the different kinds. Because if you do the neuroscience of this, we're actually pushing them on different networks in the other. So, like I say, it's kind of a fun activity. You might even want to do it early in the, you know, like you said, as a way of basically learning this, you know.
They should know the state. Great. I don't have to repeat.
They should know these.
Yeah, they should, but
They will be
I
doing
would
this. And we've actually got a game like that within the Great Lakes region. set way back in the fur trapping era. You know, the trader crook had stole some furs and was running off in a canoe somewhere, and then it's like, what river are they on, and what lake are they on, and where do they live, and where did you sometime? So, like you say, it's infinitely adaptable in that way. The trick is to keep changing the vocabulary about shape, distance, direction. Between turns out to be a really difficult concept up to about grade 3, second grade. You might find some people having trouble with it. That's where Arkansas came in, like they stayed between Illinois and it's also the way they will remember the states, that some kids just do not have a good shape memory in their head. But they can memorize between us, and you gotta privilege that for them. And other kids love to park the puzzle pieces down on here, you know, I mean, they buy the opportunity to place it.
Oh, you did put that.
Oh yeah, those things are key to this map.
They absolutely love your book. So,
Everybody likes Florida, right?
And Florida's a problem because it doesn't print 8.5 by 11, so it comes in 2 pieces, and you have to put the pieces together first.
My ride is here, but it's been great kitchen.
are you going to do the
See
raffle?
you next week.
Oh yeah, let's do a raffle.
I mean,
Real quick,
it's
like-
here. I'll say.
Wow. Let's see, the winner of the raffle.
Just 5%.
And if you already won something tonight, you're gone too, so that leaves the 3
Whoa,
goals.
That's someone else another time. Back when you were dealing with, first grade and things like that, you might actually want to have this one and this one.
Are you raffling too?
I'm not raffling these 2 off yet.
Oh, you are?
Yeah. So the winner of the first one gets to pick which map they want, and then the other one gets the other one. And what you gotta do is put a number between 1 and 10 behind your back. 1 and 10, and Carol's gonna have a number between 1 and 10 behind her back. And
But she
that's
can't
gonna
see
be-
ours then, right?
I
That's
got the
gonna be
eyes
the one that
closed,
matters.
but I'm not going to turn around and be okay. I have a number.
Okay, now you put your number up. So we got a 7 there, we got a 2
I can
7s.
change it.
Wait, who's the 7?
No.
I'll do it.
6.
We got a 7 and the 6, the 5, the 3 and 2, and you've got a
3.
I know, we did that.
well, you both have 3, then you gotta decide who gets the first one, who gets the second one.
Okay, how
Thank you very
about we
much.
do it again with 1 and 2, right?
You're good.
So what are you
Yeah.
doing here?
You gotta, you're either gonna put
Not straight.
One or 2.
she's gonna
Take
choose
care.
1 or
Thank
2
you.
and
Maybe-
one of that.
Maybe next year, do similar
But we both say the
with
same.
different grades.
You go first.
I teach
This
sports,
is the
fitness,
first
6,
time
7,
through on this one.
Well, she didn't think yet, did she?
I could tell by that.
Do a different number.
No,
22
yeah.
and 23.
Thank you. I agree.
You got a number between either 22 or
So
23.
agree, Brian. But
You
again,
got your number.
I never see any boys down there.
I will do that.
Thank you, sir.
There. You stuck with 3. You're like my niece with autism. That's why I went with 3.
You're right.
My niece with autism was just 3 and
And
everything.
what I told the guys while you guys were doing that is comments are welcome because we're gonna be doing some revision in the summer. So,
Thanks so much, you guys.
Yeah, we got a lot of.
That's how much this is all about, is getting your feedback on some of these things.
Oh, that's fine.
So how do I go
And
about?
here's the
getting-
places on the North America map, so.
If I'm interested in getting one of these maps, just email you.
Thanks, Phil. Which one do you want? Your first.
We're gonna figure out a way to get these maps to people.
We're gonna go with the big.
Ways
All
to,
right.
if you can, of course, talk your school and pay for it, that would be nice.
Right back, Fletch.
Only thing that I hear-
Chowza.
Yeah.
I hope you have a good finish.
Thank you very
Year.
much.
Yes, I would like that very much too. Okay.
He's just really messy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I have to tell you, my kids,
I will.
graders are doing.
Well,
your
you know,
culture.
he's coming with me
Units
whatever
are
day.
this month.
To
Oh.
swim.
And they senior,
All right.
Did they like the sword?
bye.
You know, we did
we did
we
the,
have pictures.
Okay.
we
I haven't
did
filled it out yet,
the
because I
turban
think I
and the
filled it out in
face mask,
August.
the
Yes.
teaching tolerance.
The culture.
I can look and
Oh, good.
see.
That's your.
I'll look and see
Navigator
here
about
if the file is,
Southern
in there.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Poverty Law Center or something like that.
Okay, and then we did the 5 religions and then the cards
Oh, good.
yesterday.
Oh, good.
So, and then what are we doing today? And then we looked at the numbers today. So
Isn't
we
that
did-
amazing? And
Yeah.
what is surprising to people are the number of people who don't have a
I know,
religion.
they were shocked. They were
Right,
shocked.
right, especially around here.
Yeah,
Yeah, everybody has a
Well,
religion.
right.
Oh, they do.
Right, and because it said no religion, atheist or,
Unaffiliated.
no, it was agnostic. They believe in something, but they're not really sure what it is, how high that was. So when I said,
Isn't
what,
it like the 4th highest or something?
maybe the 3rd, was it the 3rd? It was number 3 on the list.
It's Christian, Muslim, it's number
No,
3.
It is, yes, it was number 3.
And what would be terribly surprising in New York would be how small Judaism is.
Okay, yeah. Well, I
It's
was
so
very-
important in New York,
Well,
well, not in the world.
okay,
As
yeah,
a number,
right.
as an influence on other religions, yes. As a current today number, no.
Well, then you get in, then they start asking me questions. And the problem is, I used to, I taught school for 10 and a half years. And I'm trying to think, what can I say? What can I not say? And then, and then I have some of those kids that I taught at St. Catherine's in my class, because I'm in the same community. And then I know that they all go to CCA, but you know what? Our whole community,
RCA or.
yeah, they all go, they're all going to different religious groups, on Wednesday, but our primary goal is, when you say what's in your community, when we're in a small farming community just north of here, we either have Christianity or we're gonna have a no religion. That's it.
Right.
We're not in a big city.
Right. And there's most of, well, we do maps of the world, I think for 7th grade, about where Muslims are. Yep. And there's hardly any in the United States compared to other countries. Okay. But people in Detroit think there should be more because there's so many bad news within populated Detroit area.
Okay, the first piece of good news is that you're still out there. Bad news is, we can't take on that. Really, and this is what I should spread. The good news is, I'm all about forgery.
Mandy said I was good at
I'll let you do it.
it.
So,
I just-
thanks for doing this. You're welcome.